Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming to Cloud Asia 2014, and thank you for attending my talk this morning. It's really my privilege to be here to share with you the key findings of a study that we undertook looking at cloud adoption in the FSI sector. And that study which was commissioned by the Microsoft Corporation, was taking a look at the impediments to greater cloud adoption within the financial services industry. I'll just use the shorthand FSI. That will help me get through the talk a little bit faster. So looking at the impediments to cloud adoption within the FSI, and how the public sector and the private sector, including regulators, industry practitioners, associations, and so on, could work together more effectively to smoothen out those impediments and reach a stage where there's optimal cloud adoption in the FSI sector to unleash all the benefits that can potentially bring. So just a quick methodological note. This study relied primarily on a qualitative research methodology. We conducted in-depth face-to-face interviews, firstly with Asia Pacific and country heads of technology, CIOs, as well as heads of IT security and technology risk. So really potential customers of cloud usage within the FSI, banks, insurance companies, and so on. We also interviewed managers in government agencies with an interest in the cloud, industry experts in associations such as the ACCA, for example, and CSPs on the vendor side as well. And this was done in the second quarter of this year, so do take note that the findings of this study and the reactions of the respondents don't take into account the very recent development, which was the release of a very forward-looking consultation paper by the MAS on their technology outsourcing guidelines. And this paper, which was just released in September, about a month ago, does explicitly make reference to software and platform and infrastructure as a service, and does, I think, move the conversation forward. So this study doesn't really take into account that paper, but I will touch on that at the conclusion. So let me just jump into the key findings, and before I do that, let me just take a look at the global context before going into Singapore. So globally, here is some data from a global study by PwC looking at the adoption of cloud computing in the FSI sector versus other sectors. And contrary perhaps to popular belief, we can see here that the adoption rate is not out of line with other industries. In fact, it is approximately about the average adoption rate across a whole range of industries, across all industries. And this average figure is the same whether you look at SaaS or PaaS or IaaS. It's actually the same. So contrary to what might be thought, adoption of the cloud globally is not lagging behind other industries because of security concerns or any other kind of concern. So the potential is there. And let me now go into the Singaporean situation, and all of my slides henceforth will really be focusing on the Singapore context because that was the focus of our study. And first of all, I'd just like to talk about the economic benefits of cloud adoption within the FSI. What are those economic benefits? Well, to execute this study, Spire Research and Consulting worked together with Centennial Asia Advisors. Spire, of course, is a strategic market research and strategy consultancy. Centennial are macroeconomic analysts and forecasters. So what Centennial did was they looked at data that was produced by academics such as ETRO in 2009 and 2011, as well as Tanaka and Takagi in Japan in 2013, which validated ETRO's study. So these were macroeconomic impact studies looking at how cloud adoption impacts the economy. So they took that data and they applied that to the Singapore economy in order to forecast what might be the macroeconomic impacts of cloud adoption within the FSI over a 5-year time frame. And the conclusions that Centennial came to are very interesting. They forecasted an increase in business creation of about 1% and a neutral impact on jobs, so no job destruction from adoption of the cloud, and an increase, a stimulus to GDP of about 0.2%. They also forecasted higher productivity across most sectors in the economy and the creation of a higher value-added activities through innovation. Now let me just say a little bit more about the last 2 points. Firstly, the impact on other sectors of the economy. Now you might be surprised to see how cloud adoption in the FSI would impact other sectors. How could that be the case? Well, that's because in the context of Singapore, the FSI sector is rather important. FSI accounts for a very large chunk of GDP and value added within the economy, and IT spending as a proportion of total spending has been on a gradual uptrend over the long term in recent years within the FSI sector in Singapore, and you can see that from the data here. So what that means is that the FSI is a very important vertical segment for the ICT sector here in Singapore. So what happens in the FSI sector can actually have the effect of impacting other sectors, because if a new technology is adopted in the FSI sector, it will then make it much faster to bring that new technology to a stage where there is critical mass, where there are economies of scale, in order to make it attractive to other sectors that may be more in need of a productivity boost, sectors such as hospitality, such as transportation, such as certain parts of the manufacturing sector, and so on. So that's really the relevance of productivity improvements beyond the FSI sector, for cloud adoption, the FSI. And of course, lastly, there is the whole point about innovation, and I think this point I shall not belabor, because I think it is well understood by all of us here. Through cloud computing and the greater access to computing power that the cloud gives, we're able to take big data and apply analytics to that and extract ideas and plans and thoughts that can lead to greater innovation, and that obviously has an impact on things like total factor productivity for the economy as a whole. So this is really what is at stake when we look at the question of cloud adoption within the FSI sector. And before I go on to talk about what the respondents in our study were actually saying, let me just take a look at the cloud environment in Singapore. So the cloud environment in Singapore, of course, is viewed quite favorably, and this is really thanks to the government in Singapore adopting a whole-of-government approach, spearheaded, of course, by the IDA and the National Cloud Computing Office, which actually started life as the National Grid Office in 2003 and became the NCCO last year, and they have been actually developing standards such as the MTCS, which you have heard about, and they've also been pushing adoption in the government sector. Recently, the H-Cloud was announced, which is the public healthcare service cloud that will come on stream probably in 2017. So a lot of good work being done here, which makes Singapore a cloud-ready, cloud-enabled and pro-cloud environment relative to other countries in Asia and perhaps the world. And this is reflected in survey rankings. So here we have the ranking of Singapore in a survey commissioned by the IDA in 2012, which ranks Singapore number 6 in the world, which is really not bad. And this same study forecast over 20% growth rate in the adoption of SaaS and IaaS up to 2015, year on year. And here are results from two other surveys, the ACCA survey, which ranks Singapore 4 out of 14 in the region, and the BSA survey, which ranks Singapore 3 out of 10 in terms of cloud readiness. And one important reason for the high rankings that we see in these surveys is really the policy environment, and that is also one of the key thrusts that the IDA NCCO has in promoting the cloud in Singapore. It's to ensure that the policy environment is pro-cloud, doesn't throw up obstacles to the cloud, is cloud-enabled, cloud-ready, and so on. And that's a big reason why Singapore fares so well. You can see here a data set which is extracted from the ACCA survey of different countries' cloud readiness. And in terms of the policy environment, you see here that Singapore actually does fairly well. So going beyond just the policy environment for cloud as a whole, let me just say a few words about the policy environment for cloud adoption in the FSI. That is reasonably positive as compared to other countries in this region of the world. And that's thanks to the MAS, the Monetary Authority of Singapore, which is the regulator of the FSI sector, taking a very public position that it is not opposed to the cloud. The MAS has said that it has approved certain cloud applications and cloud projects within the FSI sector. The MAS is also extremely pro-innovation, and it has publicly pledged itself to promote Singapore as a center not just for brokerage and transaction of financial services, but also as a center for innovation. So really creating all those kind of analytics functions and data hubbing that will have an impact on the economy. So that is the stance of the MAS, and that compares quite favorably to regulators in other regions of Asia at the moment. I would mention the Philippines is another country that is also moving in this direction. They have introduced some guidance that is more or less specific to the cloud last year. The HKMA has also introduced a cloud assessment tool for banks this year. So there are other countries in the region that are also thinking along these lines and moving in these directions. But Singapore is definitely up there. Let me now go into the viewpoints of the respondents for our study, the FSIs, on their cloud adoption. So on the whole, the respondents for our study were of the view that cloud is the technology of the future for their financial institutions or FIs and for the FSI sector. I'll use the term FI to mean financial institutions, so that would mean a bank or an insurance company or so on. So the FIs were of the view that you can't fight the future. In the long term, cloud will be the de facto technology. This is not just a passing fad. And in fact, the FIs in Singapore, it was revealed, there were a number of FIs that were already using the private cloud, mostly the private cloud, for certain non-core applications. So what do I mean by non-core applications? That would cover things like commoditized services like email, customer relationship management systems, risk computing, thin client emulator, and so on and so forth. So non-core applications, it is there, it has been approved, it is operating to some extent. And there was definitely a high level of interest towards pushing the envelope for cloud adoption within the FSI sector here in Singapore. There was a bit more interest among the non-retail FIs, commercial banks and those in wholesale banking and so on, those more in the B2B business, as opposed to retail FIs who I suppose have a greater burden of regulatory compliance because they are holding a great deal of personal data. But having said that, all the FIs were enthusiastic about adopting the cloud more aggressively. And of course, it's not difficult to see why they would be enthusiastic in doing so. The cloud offers the promise of reducing operating costs. And cost reduction is very high on the agenda of FIs globally. They are facing many pressures on return on equity worldwide. This is partly due to greater regulatory compliance burdens that have been imposed globally by Basel III, for example, which limits the scope to do certain things. So cost reduction is high on the agenda, and the cloud gives them a way of reducing costs by moving from a CapEx model to an OpEx model of cost structure. It also gives the FIs more control over operating costs. So generally among the FIs that we interviewed, there was an understanding that this is the case, that these cost benefits are tangible, they can be gained, they should be pursued. In addition to that, there is also the point of agility. Maybe I should move away a bit. Meaning to say that computing power may be needed in short bursts, may be needed for certain periods of time and not uniformly across the year. For example, one global bank has reported that they have reduced the cost and time required for Monte Carlo credit risk simulation by a factor of 10 times through using cloud computing resources. So that is the kind of agility benefit that can be gained. More focus on core competencies at the organizational level. That's also an attractive benefit. So one FI actually said to us that, to quote this particular FI verbatim, he said that we recognize that as a bank we need to be good at a number of things. We need to have a number of competencies, and running our own data center is not necessarily one of them. So having great organizational focus on core competence, and then lastly, of course, using a migration to cloud computing of some ICT functions as an opportunity to harmonize various types of legacy IT systems that may be residing in different departments or different functions within the FI. So the cloud could also offer an opportunity to do that as well. However, if we look at the extent of the adoption of the public cloud, what this study found very clearly and very uniformly across all of the FIs that we spoke to was that there is a certain hesitancy, there's a certain caution about pushing the envelope more on usage of the public cloud within the FSI sector here. And the primary reason for that was because of a perception that it would be difficult to meet regulatory compliance requirements. There was some concern about regulatory compliance that was holding back a further investigation of moving forward on cloud adoption among the FIs. And as a corollary of that, the study showed that the majority of FIs did not have a very concrete roadmap for cloud adoption within the FSI in Singapore, although some of the FIs mentioned that they did have a more concrete roadmap for cloud adoption globally. So it was difficult for them to put a timeline and set a very clear goal for cloud adoption because of these concerns about regulatory compliance, which may be perceptions that could be founded or unfounded. So let's take a closer look at what those concerns are. And let me just read to you two verbatim quotes that came from respondents in this study. The first one goes, as far as we know, no banks in Singapore have managed to design a cloud solution for business critical platforms with production data. The second quote is, "Cloud is an unstoppable force. Cloud is the future. What banking regulators need to do is make the regulations very clear to make sure the adoption of cloud is safe." So you can see here there is enthusiasm and interest in going further, but there is concern that the burden of meeting the compliance requirements may be prohibitive, and that's kind of holding back a further pursuit or further going down this path. And let's take a look at what these concerns are. And if you deconstruct them, the concerns can be unbundled into 4 baskets. And I'll talk about 3 of them, but I'll leave regulatory compliance to the next slide. The regulatory compliance issue was actually the most important one, and it was also the logically prior one, in the sense that because the FIs felt that this concern was not sufficiently addressed as yet, that was hindering progress on the other concerns as well. So I'm going to talk about that in the next slide, but let me just talk about the 3 other concerns. So firstly, the absence of a common industry standard on cloud implementation in the FSI. So the FIs we spoke to, they were aware of cloud standards for security, cloud adoption codes of conduct and so on that applied for industries in general. So they were aware of the MTCS and other security standards from the CSA and ISO 27001 and so on. They were aware of these standards, but they were not aware of any standard for security or any code of conduct that was prescriptive on cloud adoption within the FSI sector in Singapore. So that was one of the things that was holding them back. Next, compliance with internal risk management guidelines. So other than regulatory compliance, of course, every FI, every bank, every insurance company has internal risk management controls headed by a chief risk management officer, and of course those controls are there to protect against commercial risk, to protect against reputational risk that would occur if there is, for example, theft of customer data. So there would be some work to be done within the FI to sync up cloud technology with these internal guidelines. But most of the FIs were of the view that these were not insuperable obstacles, and those internal hurdles could be overcome with a little bit of effort. So that was actually not the showstopper. And lastly, change management issues. Again, with the migration to any new technology, there are costs incurred for consultancy, for implementation. There is a time that is drawn upon, man hours, there is hardware costs and other costs that would be incurred. And this is true of the migration from one technology to any other technology, and cloud is no different. The FIs we spoke to were aware of these costs, and they were aware that they imposed some short-term pain, but on the whole, they did not feel that this in any way constituted an argument for not adopting cloud technology, because that's never an argument for not moving to something that is more beneficial in the long term just because there's short-term gain. So again, that was not a showstopper at all. So let's now zoom in on the issue of concerns about regulatory compliance. And if we look at that more closely, we see that this can be unbundled into 4 distinct baskets of concern as well. So firstly, let me talk about the lack of clarity in regulatory approval process. So the FIs actually were aware of the approval process, and obviously they were aware that there were cases where cloud had been approved already for non-core applications, but they perceived that the regulatory approval process could be time-consuming, it could be extensive. That was the concern that they had. And another concern which is linked to that is their perception that it was difficult for them to bring the technology vendors into the regulatory conversation. So their perception was that they would need to explain to the regulator what the cloud technology could and could not do in great detail, and that caused a certain amount of discomfort, and they would feel more comfortable in navigating this regulatory approval pathway if they could bring some of the technology vendors into that conversation to some extent. Next would be the weakening of internal control. So here actually what this boils down to is that some of the FIs were concerned about an outsourcing contract where their confidential data where they are subject to certain regulatory rules, would be actually residing with a third party. So they wanted to have a clearer contracting standard that would allow them to say that they have discharged their regulatory responsibility over that data, because otherwise then they were concerned that they would be put in a position where they are responsible for the internal control process of the vendor, of the cloud service provider. So this is really a concern about a lack of a basic standard for contracting of cloud within the FSI sector in Singapore, which is something I alluded to earlier. And next, concern over the visibility of the data, or of the geographic location of the data, I should say. So this was really a concern that under the laws and regulations, the FIs have a responsibility to protect the data, but in using the public cloud, given the fact of multi-tenancy and mingling of data and so on, their customer data may reside in a different jurisdiction. It may reside in India, for example. It may reside in New Zealand, where it would be subject to different laws. And what would be the legal position in respect of compliance with Singapore laws, such as the Personal Data Protection Act. So there was concern, not so much that this would be against the law, but there was concern that they would not have visibility about where the data was residing geographically. And this is probably actually a concern that can be ascribed to a lack of understanding and a lack of education about the technology, because, as I think most of you would be aware, the technology today does allow you to pinpoint with great precision the exact geographic location of different bits of data residing on the public cloud. So that was anyway the third concern. And the last concern was basically a concern about security, recoverability, and so on. It was basically a security concern in respect of meeting the needs of regulatory compliance. So what does that really mean? What that means is that the FIs perceived that the regulatory regime here was basically a principle-centric regime. So things like the technology outsourcing guidelines and the technology risk management guidelines are principle-centric regimes. But what was lacking from their perspective was how do those principles map onto a very concrete set of practices, a very concrete code of conduct, a very concrete structure or process that could be subject to audit and inspection from various parties themselves, third parties and so on, whereby they could say that if I follow this process, if I adopt this contracting standard with the CSP, I have discharged my regulatory responsibility and I cannot be faulted in the eyes of the law. So that was basically their concern about security. It was a concern from a regulatory standpoint. So I see I have 3 minutes left just to move towards the conclusion. Our study actually concluded with some recommendations on how we could take all these findings and really move the industry forward in terms of moving towards a more optimal level of cloud adoption within the FSI industry. And it concluded that this would really require a multi-stakeholder effort among all the stakeholders within the ecosystem. And what is at stake is not just a great benefits for individual FIs and the FSI, and not just benefits to the Singapore economy, but also a benefit in terms of the national branding, because there was a recognition among all the interviewees for this study that there was an opportunity to position Singapore as a leading hub for cloud adoption within the FSI, at least within this region, and that was a prize to be gained. So how could this be achieved? Essentially, the study proposed a two-phased approach. In phase one, industry associations and government agencies with an interest in the cloud, such as the IDA, should work in concert to prescribe clear, achievable, and internationally robust best practice standards that will be compliant with other global standards, for ensuring security and compliance within the context of a cloud outsourcing contract by an FI here in Singapore. So those standards should be clear, they should be prescriptive, they should address the kind of gaps and concerns that I spoke about earlier. And then secondly, with those standards having been developed by industry bodies, industry associations, then there would need to be a process of roundtabling with the regulator in order to reconcile those standards with the principle-centric regulatory regime, so that there would be regulator buy-in to those standards. And then that would really go a long way towards addressing all the other concerns and impediments that we spoke of. So finally, and this is really my last slide, I think what this translated to in terms of concrete recommendations for individual stakeholders was as depicted on this slide. Firstly, for the regulator, the recommendation was to exercise greater flexibility in the approval process, to try to identify and exploit opportunities to streamline the approval process and to improve efficiency of the approval process so that it takes up less resources. And of course to review opportunities to bring the technology vendors into the regulatory conversation. And to secondly provide more cloud-specific guidance. Cloud is a technology that is changing very frequently, so regulations and regulatory thinking needs to change frequently as well in response to how the technology changes. So it would be actually very beneficial to the industry if the regulator were to publish monographs from time to time to update the industry on its thinking. And I would note here again, coming back to what I mentioned earlier, a very positive development, which is that this has actually happened in September, and the MAS has released a new consultation paper about possible changes to the outsourcing and the TRM guidelines. Next, the CSPs, on their side, the technology vendors need to provide transparency to users and regulators over the location of data. They need to be very clear and open about granting audit and inspection rights, and they need to develop solutions that comply with recognized standards. And third-party audit firms have a role to play in this process as well by developing standard metrics for evaluating the CSPs, for evaluating the cloud service providers in terms of how good they are in doing that. And lastly, for the financial institutions themselves, we can't let them off the hook. So they need to define roadmaps to the cloud very clearly internally. They need to define what is a sufficient internal compliance standard. They need to have internal codes of conduct. And they need to assign sufficient levels of staffing and resources to navigate the approval process. And of course, to put in place a proper regime of monitoring to ensure no loss in risk control after approval is obtained. So with that, I come to the end of my talk. I hope it has been informative. I provide my contact information here if there are any questions. Thank you very, very much for your kind attention, and thank you to Cloud Asia and to the IDA and all the other organizers of this conference and sponsors of this conference for giving Spire Research and Consulting this opportunity. Thank you.